Something. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed faculty members, students, and honored guests, a very good morning to each one of you. We are happy to have you all here for a special session today. I have the distinct pleasure of standing before you to introduce our esteemed guest speaker for today. A pioneer in the field of creative digital design, he is a lecturer at the School of Digital Arts at Manchester Metropolitan University. His cross-domain and post-disciplinary approach to research has been at forefront of collaborative innovation, broadening the horizons of learning, design, and leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm welcome to someone whose work has not only left the indelible mark in the world of creative digital design, but has also inspired the countless individuals to push the boundaries of what's possible. On behalf of Digital University Kerala and all of you present here, I welcome Dr. Potts to the session. Sir, welcome, sir. Thank you, sir. Now the rise is yours, sir.
Okay. Sadly. So let's do that. That's the way to go. So the more special the occasion, the more likely you're going to have technical issues. This is why I always have 3 backup plans. Hopefully we'll be in. Okay. I can use this or this. Yeah. Okay. Clear enough? To give me some freedom from the antenna. Thank you for your patience. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a long travel. Yeah, I have to say, I'm a real Indophile. I've been to India quite a few times. I haven't been for the last time I was here was 2015. I was actually in Kerala. I was in Kochi. There happened to be the Biennale. And it was just the most wonderful engagement. I keep coming back to India, but every time I come back to this country, I'm amazed by the. But hopefully, I'll be able to speak to you today from a perspective, and at least my perspective, success would be that if I create some kind of moment for you further down the line where you recall this dialogue, this engagement that we've had together, changes a little bit the way that you've been thinking about what you're doing, right? I fully understand that each of us are domain specialists with a great deal of expertise, right? So I'm coming from the perspective actually of somewhat of an interloper, so someone who's coming into your world, interested in what you're doing. So I would like this to be a bit of a dialogue, and I hope that we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, because I would like to provoke to some degree a conversation between us. So, morning, my name is Robert Potts. I've come from the School of Digital Art in Manchester. The School of Digital Art, like your institute, is a very new institute. It's been open for 2 or 3 years. And it's a really interesting moment within that institute because we're really not entirely sure what we're doing, right? We all have this incredible urge and energy to engage in a different way with the world ahead, right? So there is a future orientedness about our institute. It just makes for a really exciting work day, right? So the thing that I love the most about where I work are the people that I work with. And I think this is what stimulates me to engage as a researcher, as an academic, as an industry professional, because I'm really, really interested in the relationships between people. I'm interested in really. Oh, but I'd like to, hopefully this will click forward if we're lucky. This is something that I'd like to talk about today. So what the benefit of this room gets in terms of the talks that I've been developing around this subject is I'd like to give you a kind of a synthesis of my thinking on these ideas. Now, obviously, I am not coming from an engineering perspective. I'm not an AI professional myself, but this is something that is profoundly touching each of our lives at the moment. So this is something that's come from a series of conversations that's happened over a number of years. What I'm very interested in as a researcher is the process of organizing generally. So organizing companies, organizing academic work, organizing collaboration between people, organizing design. That's kind of my lineage as a researcher. But now what we're looking at now as a creative horizon is the impact of non-human agents on the work that we do, the organizations that we create, the future that we create, right? So AI is neither a new subject, but all of a sudden we're getting, something peeking out into culture that wasn't really happening before. So this is a very interesting time for this discussion to happen, I think. And I think in terms of the way we work together, who we work with, and the work that we do, kind of the focus. I suppose from a designer's perspective, I'm interested in how we design what we do. So not just what we do, but why we do it, how we do it, what we're going to discuss today. And hopefully this will be useful. This is an image from a Stanley Kubrick film. I think these were beautiful sets created custom for the purposes of this film. But I think it's very relevant to what we're going to discuss today. There's a kind of subline for this talk, the future of human resources. I, for one, welcome our new machine overlords, right? This is kind of a riff on The Simpsons. The sound will play. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this online. If there's any problems with the sound over Zoom, please let me know. We'll have to share that as well.
Everyone, welcome.
What I like about The Simpsons, not really is an entertainment show anymore, but what I think The Simpsons are interesting for is they've been quite prescient in understanding trends that have emerged in culture, right? So because they're kind of discussing what was happening in society, somehow they were able to understand some of the trends or some of the things that were coming over the horizon, which were later proven to be of interest, right? And I think because they were thinking at the level of kind of metaphor, almost in that cartoon space, that gave them a really profound way of looking at society. I think that's what big television shows are able to do. Storytelling is good. Harry, all good? Moving on. Happening yet? This kind of gets to the heart of what I'd like to discuss today. Because it's the power of storytelling, the power of narrative, the power of design, not just in creating things, changing the way that we think and the way that we organize and the way that we lead, particularly with respect to technology, right? The thing with these emergent technologies that it's important to know is like, well, pick your emergent technology, but in this case, we would talk about trends in robotics and artificial intelligence, right? And like we've said, this is not new stuff. To go. I think what it's important to do in these dialogues that we're having around these emergent technologies, actually cut through the rhetoric, right? There is a lot of rhetoric that's around these technologies. We are framed in our thinking about how we should look at these. We can work around it. All good. Ledger. Leslie, it's going to be fleshy people. What I'd like to do is discuss a couple of these myths. I'd like to actually deal with this idea of rhetoric and technology and how we can use changes in our thinking to kind of cut through that rhetoric in order to make sense of the reality of these technologies. Right? So I'm going to use a few examples, hopefully provocative, to kind of point out some of these incommensurabilities, right? That we have with the way that we think about technology, the way that we use technology, and the way that technology is framed for us. So I'll give the example. My second subline for this talk is how I learned to stop worrying of the basilisk. But I really like this idea that we're actually dealing with time in a kind of emergent way. So technology, human intellect allows us to anticipate, right? Design is a kind of profoundly creative act. And when I say design, I think we all engage in design. Design is essentially a planning aspect, right? So we're looking about how we organize our movement and our speech and our actions in order to create our habitats and the content, right? So we have to remember that design is this kind of future-oriented mode of action, right? The basilisk comes from a kind of internet forum called Less Wrong. So this was a post by a poster called Rocco that came in 2010. And it talked about this idea. It's become known as the kind of problem of Rocco's basilisk, right? So this is pulling on absolutely kind of current debates in technology with centuries, even millennia old symbols about threat humans, right? So the idea of the basilisk is a mythological creature. So let's kind of pull this apart. Rocco's basilisk is a proposition that says that an all-powerful artificial intelligence from the future may retroactively punish those who did not assist in bringing about its existence, right? So it resembles a futurist version of Pascal's wager, which we can look at it in a minute. So the basilisk is a thought experiment proposed in 2010. And it's this idea that we may be participating in this situation right now in this room by discussing this, okay? So by anticipating the emergence of a superintelligence, are we actually assisting the emergence of that superintelligence, or are we kind of resisting it, right? We're essentially, by having these discussions, participating in a dialogue about a future state of technology, right? So you could take this very literally and say, okay, there's going to be a big bad Terminator supercomputer who's going to put us all in a kind of simulated hell in the future. Or you can see this as a metaphor about technology, right? And our engagement with technology, because the actions that each of us in this room right now take from this day will determine the future outcome, the things that we end up doing, right? So my perspective on this as a strategic designer involved in the development of strategy, idea of course, right? So dependent on the course that you set in this moment, it will determine the outcome future states, right? So we have to be very, very wary about where we set out and the framings that we use build, right? So we're all possibly computer scientists in the room, familiar with this idea of trash in, trash out, right? Yeah. We have to actually have a really serious debate about the kind of thoughts, the kind of framings, the kind of data that we kind of feed into our development of these technologies. But also, if we're training large language models, for example, what is it that we're training them on, you know? This is a really interesting debate. And I think what I'd like you to do with me is play the kind of, what I'd like to call the kind of believing and doubting game, right? We're kind of simultaneously zooming in and looking at this as a very practical issue of technological development. And at the same time, we're suspending belief and we're entering this kind of metaphorical space and we're thinking about how we frame technologies, right? Both of these things are important, right? Not one at, one after the other. They have to happen, they have to occur. I think in institutes like this, where you get a mix of disciplines, where you're able to have the influence of technology, the influence of different domains, the influence of design, possibly the influence of things like coming from the arts, literature, poetry. That may be coming from your outside life. It may be coming from what you listen to on the radio. But I think all of these influences are fundamentally important. And then it becomes a process of how you organize and coordinate that into meaningful future. Oh, get into it. Obviously, this is an analogy back to the Kubrick film, right? So could we make the analogy that the technologies that we're developing now are potentially as devastating as the kind of nuclear technologies that were developed after the Second World War, during the Second World War? In terms of change, in terms of social change, in terms of ecological change, I have no doubt that the technologies that we're dealing with right now are as likely to have as profound an effect, if not more, in the development of the technology. And we're right at that moment where we're beginning to deal with those changes in society that have been brought about because of the emergence of a new threat to civilization, right? Things are never neutral in technology. They're never always negative either, yeah? And this is why I put my eyes to this idea of strategy. It's about how we modify or sort of steer this course, how we sail this path forward. I think is absolutely key. So, in terms of rhetoric, another Kubrick film. This is 2001. This. So that strange blue light, see there? It's the switching on of a nuclear reactor. So that's Cherenkov radiation, right? So it's the movement of particles through a medium that creates this kind of uncanny strange blue light, right? So the first people to switch on the first reactors, the first perceive this Cherenkov radiation, this strange blue color, were the first people to have perceived it. Equally, while we're having conversations with ChatGPT-4, it could be that we're witnessing a different kind of, language, information, light, communication, and we might be the first humans to have witnessed that kind of an exchange. Now, there will be analogies in culture and history back through, intellectual study. However, we may be in new horizons already. It's not coming, we're already there, okay? So now we need to develop our kind of civilization or ability to be resilient in the face of technology in order to match these emergencies, right? So we're Dave, right? We're facing up something that's quite profound, something that is beyond our understanding. So I want to give this idea of kind of, and we find this with a lot of technical systems, right? There is a level, for example, in computer code, possibly with complex engines or systems, there is a level of inscrutability, right? So we're unable to understand the level of complexity. So often there are strategies that we have, black boxes, for example, right? But this idea of inscrutability, the inability to see in on the complexity of a system is a real problem that we're facing in terms of technology. You just have to almost moderate or ameliorate the effects of the technology. So, rhetoric. And this is something that's written into at least Western culture, Hollywood. This idea that we should be kind of fearful of the emergence of machines. They're coming to take our lives, they're coming to take our jobs, but also we're kind of like enthralled by the aesthetics of these machines. They're kind of profoundly powerful objects. They have almost like a presence. They're kind of cool, but also we're being slowly kind of inducted into this idea that this is something we need to be very wary of, right? That these are somehow kind of a predatory influence, right? I think we need to go past this. We need to cut through this rhetoric. So this is a kind of position that I've put together that sort of unifies this series of talks that I'll be giving in India. So we're interested not only in the potentials and pitfalls of emerging intelligence systems and their application within complex industries, but the ways that human experience, action, and cognition will change with respect to the presence of these technologies. Already this morning, I've had a discussion with the wonderful team here, and we talked about this idea of digitization, digitalization. So we have this kind of like step forward. So first of all, we use computers as part of what we do, right? And the second step, digitalization, we start to, those computers, those infrastructures start to kind of influence and become absolutely kind of fundamental to what we do. So our internet or smartphones or gaming systems or social media, I think are kind of symptomatic of digitalization, right? So it isn't evenly distributed globally, but for the most part, I can kind of assume that most people in this room have reasonably regular access to digital services, right? The internet, a browser, that kind of thing, right? And you start to see the fundamentals, the discussion I've been involved in as a researcher for some time is this idea of digital transformation, right? So it's the third step on this kind of taxonomy of digital development, right? Intelligence of computers, the impact of those technologies as systems on what we do in daily life, and then digital transformation, I think ultimately is how we reorganize with respect to these. This is where the change in the way that people think comes. Is where the change in the way that society is organized, the way that it looks like, the way that it feels like. For example, the hotel that I'm staying in, there is no paper menu. There's a QR code, right? There are big issues of inclusion with that because I have to have a smartphone. I have to make sure that it's charged, you know, so ultimately there's a barrier of access into that space, right? Intimately, meaning that we have completely reorganized. And I think the pandemic only accelerated this, particularly in the Western world, right? It has changed the way that people come to work. It's changed the way that people communicate and work. It's changed the way that people, where they are when they work. It's changed pretty much every aspect. And this is only going to continue. So people like Justin Trudeau, World Economic Forum. I know we're not connected via the speakers, but I'll try. Hopefully you can hear at least some of this. Probably can't hear that. Pace of change has never been this fast, but it will never be this slow again, right? Hearing this at kind of World Economic Forum, this was 5 years ago. Yeah. When was this said? This is an example of technological rhetoric, right? Things are moving fast at the minute, but they're slow compared to where we're going to be in 10 years. But that's definitely something that we all kind of experience, right? The other aspect of this is the kind of myth of progress, right? Is that we were worse back then and we will be better in the future, right? And I think the Indian context for me in particular is a real exemplification of that is not the case, right? This idea that we are somehow lifting ourselves out of the mud continuously for generations, hundreds of generations and thousands of years, and the knowledge that we'll have in the future will be better than the knowledge that we have in the past. Kind of put that back to you. Is that the case? But this is another example of a myth of technology. So I do believe Justin Trudeau when he says that the pace of change is accelerating, but I'm also extremely skeptical about this myth of progress, right? Because it may be that is not the case, yeah? This is something that we've really kind of have to be mindful when we're working in our individual roles, in our projects, developing technologies. Is this for the good? Is this something that can be sustained? Does it create social resilience or does it create, in words of coders, is it cruft? You know? Is it for the good or is it just for the bottom line? Oh, what you'll see in this talk, and myself included, you often see like a lot of white guys. Yeah, this is the Dartmouth conference. So this was a summer where a group of influential early pioneers in artificial intelligence came together and put down, sort of began the kind of framing of this debate. Yeah. Now, obviously, this is kind of computer science history, but this is really framed, you know, in a similar way that von Neumann set out the kind of fundamentals of computers that we still use in every single device that we have. There are these kind of inaugural initial moments where things are set in place, right? This was one of them. What I'm interested in is where are those next meetings? Where are those next moments of understanding going to come from? Where are they going to happen? Are they going to be a continuance of what's happened or are they going to be coming from emergent situations, right? I'm very interested almost in the craft of creating the conditions for those kind of conversations to happen, right? Probably all recognize this guy. This is Steve Jobs. Because we're having sound issues, you don't need to necessarily hear from Steve. One of the initial influences on the birth of Apple Computer, well known, is this idea of efficiency, right? So Jobs was reading an article in Nature, something like that, and it was talking about the relative efficiency of different, right? So the difference between energy expenditure, size of animal, basically bang for buck. How much they could turn a piece of food into efficient. Tens of kilometers, thousands of kilometers. We're looking at this relative efficiency. So is the graph, yeah? You should be able to see this here. Y-axis, you've got this kind of cost to move, yeah? Kind of body weight, right? And it allows us to look at all different organisms kind of in the same kind of plane, I suppose, right? This is a really interesting sort of mapping. What's interesting about this graph is that they've actually added in some sort of, knowable or known kind of creatures, the bee, the hummingbird, the budgerigar, the rabbit. We all kind of have an intuitive sense of how long they live and how fast they move, how far they go, that kind of stuff. But also, examples, familiar animals to us like dogs, pigeons, salmon, a horse, and then kind of the inclusion of technology, transportation, right? So helicopters, jet fighters, light planes, jet, yeah? So the cost to move, this ratio is a really interesting space. Where this ended was the inclusion of, I think we've kind of missed the point, yeah? We have man here, yeah? Sort of in the mix, yeah? And all of a sudden you put a man on a bicycle and their ability to move goes up exponentially, right? So the efficiency of movement. We have a piece of technology here that is allowing the movement of a person to become exponentially more efficient, right? Just basically by putting us on, right? And obviously there is this incredible culture, human culture around bicycles as well. And what Jobs was trying to put forward was that he saw the emergence of computer systems, particularly personal computer systems, devices, things like this, all kind of written, I suppose. In the 1950s, the idea that we'd be carrying around devices, Norbert Wiener in the first text of cybernetics was talking about this nightmarish scenario where everyone would be walking around with devices in their pockets that would continuously give feedback into a larger system. Yeah. Hobbes was saying that ultimately he saw the computer as a bicycle for the mind, right? Now zoom forward 20, 30 years. Now we're looking at these kind of intelligent systems. There has been an explosion even in the last 6 months in application of artificial intelligence systems. Are we looking at a bicycle for a mind scenario? Where is the metaphor that is relevant to this context? Yeah? Because we're not talking about an efficiency here in terms of thinking. We're actually potentially talking about a different kind of mind, right? So we have to kind of understand whether or not we're talking about something that is agonistic to us, so outside of us, something that is entirely separate, that is a system that will be out there in the world doing its thing, or is this going to be essentially a cobot? Is this going to be something that extends or expands the capacity of human mind, right? So this is the kind of space that we're in at the minute. I think we need to be thinking about these new metaphors, these kind of new framings of technology, because they will influence what we end up designing, right? So this is the kind of next stage. I want to talk about, I want to kind of localize this, right? This idea of efficiency or kind of bang for the buck, yeah? Kerala has just under 3% of the population, 2.5%. But it contributes over 4%. Now, these figures are 10 years old, right? Well, actually, this situation might have changed radically. And looking at Kerala in the last, in the 10 years since I was last here, I think it has changed radically. Whilst this is happening, the rate of growth in Kerala has been less than Indian growth, right? Is that a bad thing? Or is there some smart planning happening here? Are we actually increasing that ratio of, bang for the buck in terms of people and their kind of contribution to a larger economy? We're doing that and increasing that efficiency, but actually not focusing necessarily on growth. Yeah. Perhaps that actually might be an intelligent strategy. Now, I'd have to dig into this a little bit further, but I think this kind of preoccupation with economic growth in the way that we look at it at the minute is necessarily not always a great thing, right? Now, obviously, there are different kinds of growth, but this continuous outflow of products and services, this kind of cruft that adds to the kind of damage of our environments, this kind of stuff, there's going to be a reckoning in terms of this, right? So I think even the way that we think about economic growth is going to be very, very radically important over the next 10 years, 50 years, because I think we're rapidly heading towards a kind of economic reckoning with the models that we have in place at the minute. Now, this isn't coming from a kind of politically ideological position. This is coming from a critical position, So we should have the ability as scholars, as academics, to like lift ourselves above belief and actually look at the situation as it stands. Yeah. Our responsibility as scholars is actually to look through the belief system, the prevailing political ideology, and actually see what is really happening in the economic, political, technological, social situation, cultural situation that we find ourselves in. So Liam Gibson famously said, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed, right? Now, this isn't some kind of like sly dig at India as a developing country, You see this everywhere you look, right? Technologies and their application, their understanding is very, very... What you find is that different disciplines in their approaches have radically different understandings of the kind of core concepts, principles, and ideas that are applied by other disciplines. Now, this is a fundamental problem. This is what, when it comes down to how we organize what we're doing together, right? So hopefully we've kind of opened the debate. For me, world leaders, Trudeau, the World Economic Forum, Modi in this case, they're seizing upon the kind of economic potential of these emerging automation, AI, robotics, They're looking to the universities to say, hey, like how do we put a yoke around this, east and leverage the potential growth or for development purposes? Let's look at the reality. So this is the American context, just for ease. This is the average company lifespan in years. There's some statistical manipulation done to make sure that this is a 7-year rolling average. Starts in 1965, so we see an image of the average S&P 500 company, so top 500 companies in the US economy. For the most part, we're about 32, yeah, so middle age, yeah. We saw a real drop-off as it moved through the 60s. There must have been some kind of culling off of older businesses into new ones. And in the 70s, lifting up, almost getting older, some kind of establishment of new routines, seeing a kind of economic cycle type wave happening here. But ultimately, you can see that we can probably agree there's a downtrend, right? So where are we in 2024? We are roughly, the average age of an S&P 500 company is 17, yeah? I mean, that's fairly comparable to the average age. We spoke to Tata Consultancy Services in November. one of the largest consultancy, what do you call it, organizations, companies in the world. And the average age of workers in that company was, early 20s. Yeah. We're looking at a situation where radical churn and kind of change to the organizational landscape is a reality that we're having to deal with, right? This also says that, I mean, this is really choppy waters in terms of starting a business or a startup or intellectual property. But I think we need to pay attention to these signals because they actually allow us to cut through the rhetoric. So you see a lot about STEM subjects. I've heard them refer, if you really, really think about the influence of the arts and humanities in that, you often end up with STEAM. Yeah. I really like this way of looking at it. I mean, it's just another acronym, I suppose. But this is this kind of fourth industrial. So this really covers this kind of subject matter that we're talking about, the sort of subject matter, the substantive stuff, topic of this talk. This idea of smart technologies, artificial intelligence, robotics, and algorithms. So STARA. And I think what's interesting coming from my perspective as I suppose, as a design methodologist or design strategist, I'm really interested in how we use our ways of thinking as technical specialists, work together to organize our kind of domains and our disciplines, but also to ultimately to solve problems, right? We do have this responsibility to actually see if we can make a difference to the world, right? See if we can actually engage in a positive way to improve. And I don't just mean sort of socially or culturally. I mean at all levels. What we do as professionals, as industrial experts or academics, is we're engaging with problems. This is where you get this really unusual overlap between the histories of AI and the histories of design. So design, or the study of design, one of the most profound thinkers in that field coming from the 50s was actually one of the forefathers of AI. So Herbert Simon talked about this idea as a scholar. He was interested in kind of intelligent systems. He was interested in setting out the principles of a field that he named artificial intelligence. But ultimately, what he was looking at in order to realize that was the structure of problems. So if you read Herbert Simon's work, what you're looking at is how he was trying to understand almost kind of rationally, mathematically at some point, how problems are structured, right? Now, there was some profound work done on this, like the intellectual study of the structure of problems, right? Sadly, this ended up falling foul of its own success, right? This is where you saw the early emergence of the kind of design methods movement, realizing that design wasn't another form of science, but was an entirely different intellectual prospect in its own right, but naive, undeveloped. And I think at the core of design, and at the core of what an artist does, for example, the core of what a poet does, people who are engaged in this kind of active creativity, Herbert Simon called this the sciences of the artificial, right? So he's actually trying to study this process wherein humans create things that don't exist before that point, right? But as this field developed, what we found is that if you actually really, go quite deep into the structuring of problems, you find these kind of incommensurabilities. It's not entirely rational all the way down, right? And the reality of it is, and this is what we recognize in contemporary situations, the problems that we face today, is we end up in this kind of wickedness, right? Problems that are intractable, irresolvable, yeah? Problems that are resistant in their nature to solutions, right? So when we realize that there are problems out there, for example, homelessness or poverty, or even some quite basic, like technological, rational problems, we actually find that there's all sorts of unsolvability in those problems. So how do we deal with these problems? This has kind of become the core of design, I suppose. Yeah? So design as a discipline as it's built out as a kind of counterpart to science, a counterpart to the scientific method, a different rationality, has started to deal with this idea of incommensurability, so unsolvability, problems that are resistant to solution. Now, maybe you can tell me the kind of problems that you work on likely are those kind of problems, right? They're not problems that are easily, it might be little sub-problems or micro worlds that you're able to kind of resolve on the way to something. But the larger domain that you'll be working in will be presenting problems to you that are here to be unsolvable or resistant to solution. So the things that you do in that problem domain essentially just change the domain, you know, don't solve anything. This idea, this comes from Keys Dorst, this idea that the situations, the problem situations that we now face are open, they have no boundaries, they're complex, they have many elements and relationships, so they're interwoven with other problems. They're dynamic, as in they change over time, they're extremely complex, and they're networked, right? They don't happen within single institutes, they happen across. So we're facing a real complex situation. I want to kind of look at what each of us as individuals are kind of doing and how that connects with others in our domain, right? So this is Edward Hutchins. Edward Hutchins, this is from a book called Cognition in the Wild. So he was trying to think about what humans actually do out in the world, out in practice. So what it actually looks like to be a human that's trying to learn something, that's trying to influence a problem domain, but also possibly trying to lead or influence others that are working in the same domain, right? So this is the kind of stuff that we're involved with, right? And we end up with this, I think this is a really beautiful diagram actually, right? Because it explains what all of us are doing kind of all of the time, right? So in each moment, we're conducting an activity. This can be something that happens within our institute, within our research programs, or this could be something that happens, you know, when we're cleaning our house or planning a holiday, right? This idea that we're conducting these activities, this is something that's flowing through time. We're continuously doing this, but at the same time, developing the practice. So we're getting better at what we're doing. We're really thinking about how we're organizing our time, how we're going about it, how we're organizing our day, right? So by doing that, reflecting on it, we're actually changing the practice itself. So imagine yourself in the thing that you do that's the most technically or highly developed or kind of expert in what you do individually. You're engaged in the development of that practice at each moment of doing the task, right? But at the same time, what you're doing is you're shaping the field. You're developing all of the other practitioners who do it, right? I think this kind of nexus of all of these layers of development, yeah, I think is a really profound way of dealing with the open, networked, dynamic, complex nature of problems, right? So that presents us with a problem. If we're changing the field every time we do something, how do we ensure that those changes are actually applied over? How are they going to influence other people, right? How are we going to share those practices? And the simple answer is we work together, yeah? The reality of working together is it's quite complicated, right? This is what I've found. So we're already seeing these profound kind of applications of these technologies, right? This is something that's happening in the public domain all over the world at a rapid pace, yeah? Particularly with respect to AI technology. So I'll kind of talk through these projects a little bit. So DeepMind obviously is a big player in this. So DeepMind, we're associated with the chess and Go playing robots that kind of hit the news a few years back. We were able to develop a system to play a very complex Japanese board game better than human agents, right? Very quickly, this was almost a proof of concept or a prototype for developing a learning system. And then where DeepMind have gone from this has been absolutely extraordinary, right? This developing something, you know, using AI technology to do kind of parametric development of things in computer games or environments or engagements or the movement of players or non-player characters within a game. all of a sudden you're finding, like steam, like steam technology, AI is suddenly becoming this kind of animating force that is influencing all of the other domains, right? So we can already see the kind of movement of the practitioners, the change in the field, the action that we're doing as individuals being influenced by influence of sort of not necessarily intelligent, but non-human agency, right? And this one, and we can look at this on the next slide. This is the AlphaFold project, right? Has anyone seen this project before? Anyone familiar with AlphaFold? Really interesting example of what Google DeepMind did next. Or look at this in the next slide. There are thousands of examples, and they're emerging every single day. I'm kind of isolating a few good examples, right? So this is AlphaFold. Back to Tom Cruise in a second. This is a learning algorithm. It was essentially trained to think about the structure of proteins, right? So I'm not a protein biologist, but there are roughly 100,000 proteins that are absolutely fundamental to kind of human and animal life, right? Now, the narrative that's interesting here is, in order to resolve the structure of a protein, the old processes that you would use, X-ray crystallography, very complicated, very precise, highly technical process to essentially take X-rays, microscopic X-rays of diffraction patterns of a protein, right? And then from that, you'd be able to back infer that there might be some structure in that protein, right? Now, this was something that for a very long time was, like a frontier field, right? And then the principles of the field, the practices and the technology were laid out in such a way that it became something that was doable. It was something that was teachable. And then it became, a process of actually doing the work, right? So we'd identified the proteins, we'd seen some of them, and that was helping us to understand other ones. But ultimately, we had a big, long list of ones that we needed to do, right? So this kind of process of finding the structure of proteins, sort of debate this idea that it was basically a PhD, right? So one molecule per PhD, right? So if you're like me, I think because I had kids in the middle of it, it took me 7 years to do my PhD. Well, let's say 3-4 years, right? And then all of a sudden you have AlphaFold. It was one of these situations, a wonderful story in science. We weren't really ready to go, but they thought, nah, they actually let this go. They released the data into the system and left it running over the weekend. By the time they came back after the weekend, essentially AlphaFold had resolved the list. Yeah? Nearly 100,000 proteins had been resolved by the system. And then it was the process, and this is an example of this, essentially this is the guess, yeah, the guess at the molecular structure, and then you basically do a comparison with the data, right? A comparison with the crystallography data, right? So essentially the work, let's say if it's this is obviously very broad brush, the 100,000 times 3, yeah? 300,000 years to resolve all of these proteins, right? This is something that was done in a matter of, let's say, if it wasn't over the weekend, a matter of months. Yeah. And this is the kind of impact of these systems. So it's not necessarily a terminator. It's not someone that's having a conversation with you, but ultimately it's the impact of an artificial system that's able to investigate inscrutable, enormous data sets, whether or not that's astronomical data or wave data from the oceans, or kind of agricultural data on kind of crop health, for example, or growth of trees from satellite data. We have these systems all of a sudden that are able to make, exponentially vast data sets scrutable in a quick way, right? And this is kind of obviously a very accelerative force, right? This is something that's going to create great acceleration. This is kind of where we're at. So going back a little bit to this one, how does this relate to Tom Cruise, right? How does AlphaFold relate to Tom Cruise? Why are these things relevant to one another? Why are they essentially examples of the same thing, right? Won't play you the video, but this is not Tom Cruise, right? So this is a TikTok account called Deep Tom Cruise, right? And this is someone's profession now, and they do really well out of it. But essentially, they do impersonations of Tom Cruise, right? Doing Tom Cruise things. They are not Tom Cruise, and they're using machine learning to basically put Tom Cruise's face on their face in a really convincing way, right? And increasingly, we're going to see, I see from a kind of creative industries perspective, the idea that artists or thinkers, I mean, this has already happened with a kind of, there was a project for the philosopher Daniel Dennett. Essentially, a group of computer scientists and philosophers trained a large language model on the work of Daniel Dennett. So they used the works and the papers and the kind of correspondences, everything that was extant in the world about Daniel Dennett to train a large language model of Daniel Dennett to create a kind of AI bot, I suppose, a chat bot. And then they did a kind of a controlled study of whether or not they asked people who were Daniel Dennett scholars, and they presented the AI and the real Daniel Dennett with the same questions, and then did a very controlled psychological study of, yeah. The results of that were astonishing, yeah? So most people, they got it about 50-50, right? So these scholars of Daniel Dennett chose the real Daniel Dennett half of the time, right? So if you think about that in a kind of creative industries perspective, you think about A.R. Rahman or, you know, Bob Dylan, great poets, people who have a particularly beautiful voice or a particularly amazing way of playing an instrument, for example. We're at the moment now, this isn't something that's coming, this is something that's happening now, where all of that intellectual property, all of that beauty that's contained in that voice or that ability to play an instrument or use a tool is something that can be kind of codified into an artificial system. This is a really uncanny place to be, right? So we've seen kind of artificial or virtual projections of ours or people who have passed. But I think this is going into an entirely new creative horizon in terms of the way that we're able to kind of extrapolate this intelligence and actually modify or kind of codify this within a kind of semi-intelligent system, right? So, thing on, we get us back to the basilisk, right? So, ultimately, what we're talking about is decision theory, right? So we have these powerful decision-making systems. We also need to think about the role of how we make decisions, right? So, we talked about this, the basilisk, named after this kind of legendary reptile which could cause death with a single glance. See this in Harry Potter, they use a basilisk. Because merely hearing the argument would suppose that you put it at risk of torture from this hypothetical agent yet to emerge. A basilisk in this context is any information that harms or endangers the people, right? This is where we go to nation. This is kind of a version of Blaise Pascal's wager. And this was an argument about the belief in a higher power, right? Pascal's wager very quickly. You've got two choices, yeah? You can believe in something, or you can choose not to believe, right? Obviously, this is coming from a kind of Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic perspective, monotheism. But ultimately, you know, this is applicable to, right? You can choose to believe or not believe. God exists, and we believe. We have it in the Christian system, at least. Infinite reward. We get to go to heaven. We don't believe. When we die, we're going to go to hell. So say. Good. If God does not exist, we believe we have finite loss. So we've changed what we do on earth. This kind of like limited loss. If we don't believe or does not exist, there's finite gain, right? So Pascal's wager was that ultimately, but we should believe because we've got no way of knowing. This is something that's outside of our ability to know, right? So you get this kind of idea of, now, I've not got any particular skin in the game. I don't think that we're necessarily talking about belief here. And I'm definitely not analogizing AI to God, right? But I think you have this situation where you have frameworks, you have ways of understanding the world. Remember, this is what we have control of, right? We have ways of learning about the world that are profoundly helpful to make sure that we don't make silly mistakes in what we design and what we do every day. That's the point of what I'm trying to say. Pascal's wager really gets to some really interesting stuff about the nature of uncertainty, about being a human on the earth, right? In the midst of complexity. So this is our true state. This is what makes us incapable of certain knowledge and of absolute ignorance. We sail within a vast sphere, ever drifting in uncertainty, driven from end to end. When we think to attach ourselves to any point and then fasten to it, it wavers and leaves us. And if we follow it, it eludes our grasp, slips past us and vanishes forever. Nothing stays for us. This is our natural condition. And yet, contrary to our inclination, we burn to find solid ground, an ultimate sure foundation whereon we build a tower reaching into the. That's what institutions do. That's what universities are for, right? But our whole groundwork cracks and opens to abysses, right? So they're kind of a poetic, quite a poetic sort of statement about the nature, the epistemology of doing what we do, right? So what do we do in the face of this reality? I'm kind of here to discuss. Look at the kind of practicalities of this, right? So we're zooming from the 1600s back to 2020s, and we see relevance 400 years ago to the debates that we're having today, right? So Elon Musk is very much fearful of the emergence of these technologies or their kind of potential. So we're not stronger or faster than other creatures, you know, the bike for the mind idea, but we are more intelligent. And here we are for the first time really in human history with something that's going to be far more intelligent than us, right? May already be here. We've got Altman from OpenAI saying, yeah, he's kind of a meme guy. Yeah, I actually don't think we're gonna go extinct. I think it's gonna be great. Yeah. I think we're heading towards the best world ever. I hope he's right. But when we deal with a dangerous technology as a society, we often say we have to confront and successfully navigate the risks to get to enjoy the benefits, right? I mean, how far are we from either of these realities right now? Yeah. You know, if I can't scan the QR code for the menu in the restaurant, you know, doomed. Okay. This is something that, you know, this isn't kind of fun debates. You've got these people that are incredibly powerful and kind of living in the meme space, right? Almost playing fast and loose with futures, right? But you've got governments that are really kind of like wringing their hands over what this is actually going to mean politically and economically, right? So this is the Bletchley Declaration. Bletchley famously was where the Enigma device was developed in the Second World War. So cryptography used as almost as an anti-weapon to bring a conflict to an end, right? This is the declaration. Particular safety risks at the frontier of AI. Substantial risks may arise from potential intentional misuse or intended issues of control relating to alignment with human intent. These issues are in part because these capabilities are not fully understood and are therefore hard to predict. So that kind of inscrutability problem. There is potential for serious, even catastrophic harm, either deliberate or unintentional, stemming from the most significant capabilities of these AI models, right? So this is a kind of government declaration. It's not just one government, this is a group of governments, right? And they're saying, we don't know, we don't know what's going to happen, right? This is a really interesting place to be. And yet we've got this kind of infrastructure in place, right? Not something that's happened in the past. This is something that's already kind of underway. Widely, highly sophisticated, developed infrastructure already, right? We need models to help us, right? How am I doing for time? Great, perfect. These kind of analogies, right? This comes from Deleuze. The idea of the orchid and the wasp, right? And their relationship to one another. So the reproductive structures of the orchid through the process of evolution come to resemble the reproductive structures of wasp, right? So you're getting some kind of like synergy between these organisms. They're symbiotes, right? They're ultimately a kind of oversystem, right? There's something that's becoming a system of systems, right? So through processes that we understand, processes that are kind of beyond, you know, the kind of epigenetic change in the structure. Deleuze was interested in this because he talked about this idea of territory, right? Because the relationship between the wasp and the orchid becomes mutually, their fates become overlapped. Yeah, so for reproduction, pollination, for eating purposes, all of these different practices of these organisms become overlapped, right? You all of a sudden get these super systems, right? Really interesting situation to be in. Get back to the Kerala context, right? Deleuze talked about this idea of territorialization, right? So when the wasp changes its structure in order to make use of the orchid and vice versa, what it's doing is it's deterritorializing. Yeah. So the wasp and the orchid change their territory, their environment through their kind of engagement. The last time I was in Kerala, one of these tours that they take tourists on to see kind of old Kerala industries. Yeah. This is dry ginger. To me, this looks like a painting from Goya, you know, 17th century, 16th century. These are kind of profound ways of organizing. The top bit of it looks like it could be thousands of years ago. The bottom of the photograph, you have all the, which I've selectively cropped out. Yeah. This idea of, this is kind of like the core of our discussion here, right? This idea of when we engage with systems, with complexity, with technology, it changes the territory, it changes us, right? So when we use technologies, we are territorializing, right? We're changing the world by applying those technologies to the world, right? But those technologies are territorializing us in return, right? We are being deterritorialized, right? So this happens with technologies, but this also happens with global capital, right? So you have these practices, you have this wonderful kind of local territory, this kind of social fabric, but this is deterritorialized, right? By the process, by the application of technologies. And this is a site of incredible potential, but it's also a site of incredible loss. Yeah. This is where we kind of come to the end. This is when we begin to think about where we apply these technologies, how we apply these technologies, how we think about applying these technologies, how we humanize these technologies for application. I think is the kind of crux. This is where we're at, right? And this is where we have to go back and think about Hutchins. We have to think at every moment, in every line of code, in every sentence we write down, in every kind of reflection, in every assessment that we develop or we do, or every curriculum that we develop, we have to think about how we're changing the practice, how we're changing the field, right? We have to think about that as humans, but we also have to think about how this process of digital transformation is re-territorializing or deterritorializing us, right? Yeah. So you only have to go to the kind of the big Lulu Mall that's right across the road from my hotel to see that deterritorialization process happening. You know, it's wonderful. It's great. I can go get a coffee. I can go and buy myself, you know, some international luxury goods, right? But I could also do that exact same experience in Manchester or in New York or in Los Angeles, right? So there is this process of territorialization that's ongoing at all times, right? This is me thinking about this process. What does this synergy between artificial systems, humans look like? Yeah. What does the appropriate application, how we're going to use these technologies good for great change to create territories that we actually want to live in? Yeah. Beyond that, how do we create territories in the future that are actually habitable by humans? Yeah? With breathable air and food to eat, right? So you can kind of quickly do this, like deterritorialize. This is a responsibility that we have collectively, right? It is a great responsibility. We are playing Pascal's wager. We are basically wrapping the basilisk around our necks. We're playing an extremely dangerous game. And I think it's bringing that focus back to how dangerous the game it is that we're playing, right? And how fundamental we are as players in that game, right? That's what I wanted to talk about. You know, we have these systems that can kind of accelerate the way that we envision futures. So you think about the kind of the hand loom technologies that happen in this country, in Kerala, the technologies that are absolutely fundamental to the sort of ancestral trade. How are these things going to be changed? How are they going to not just completely, you know, move? Manchester used to be, there used to be more cotton mills and looms in Manchester than there were in the city of Manchester than there were cotton mills in the whole of North America, right? The experience of deindustrialization in absolutely profound, right? Now we have these technologies that can support how we make these decisions, right? And this is what brings us to the end. So I want to leave you with this. This is Conway's law, right? This kind of, for me, encapsulates this responsibility, yeah? As an institute, as individuals, this is something that we really need to think about, yeah? As intellectual fields, as researchers, as part of an international community, that kind of thing, right? Conway's law in the 60s, sadly, is always true. Any organization that designs a system, defined broadly, so it could be a computer system, it could be a way of organizing something, it could be a curriculum, it could be anything. Systems are organization that designs a system defined broadly will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication, right? We're kind of doomed, yeah? So the systems that we create will be a product of how we communicate with one another, right? Inevitably, sadly, yeah? And that includes these amazing intelligent artificial, right? And the way that we engage with them. If we don't think about those fundamental principles of how we think and communicate with one another and be prepared to change those ways of doing that for the good, we risk this, yeah? We essentially will just reproduce the problems of the past and they will continue on to the future. And this is where we can never get away from these intractable problems, right? We end up in a situation where we're just reproducing, yeah? We think that we're engaging in problem-solving activity. What we're actually doing is reproducing the same traps, right? That's where I kind of pass the responsibility to you. And I hope there'll be some interesting questions around this. I think I've gone about 5 or 6 minutes over, 5 minutes over. Thank you very much. I'm really, really, really keen to hear some questions from you. Thank you. Sadly, yes. think I think the change from the 60s, it's not just us now. We're increasingly seeing systems that are, if not minds, like parts of minds. And I think if anything, it kind of reinforces this. Because ultimately these intelligent systems that we're developing are a product of communication. So, for example, the large language model training problem. If we're using the internet, if we're using Twitter to train our LLMs, we're going to find that we possibly don't like the intelligent systems that we're talking to, right?
How do you see it?
This is interesting. I mean, maybe the reality of it is with this kind of, I suppose, this idea of non-human systems, non-human resources. I think we're in the early stages of kind of understanding some of this knowledge and putting those principles in place. I'd venture that if we put the right principles, if we actually study this as an issue in place, then the systems that we build will allow us to circumvent this kind of ability problem. But I do have this strong sense that there are certain things that are robust, difficult to shift. Yeah. I think it's focusing on those problems, not necessarily just on the technological problems, that becomes really important. It's almost the kind of philosophy of technology. Yes, obviously, but it's about how we apply that philosophy of technology, the way that or the moments of actually making the technology, not after the fact, you know? That would be my perspective. I think the most interesting adaptive systems that I can think of are people, right? I think ultimately what I see in the work that I do as an academic, it ultimately rests on the ability of people to adapt. Yeah? I think we are seeing systems that are a bit more flexible, but ultimately I think it's the ability of humans to kind of rethink the way that they're doing things that doesn't rely on technology, right? Might as well say, like, are we going to stop the development of farming? You know, I think it's kind of an inevitability ultimately that these technologies are going to develop. But I think the key thing, is it going to be this kind of like linear progression towards better? You know, it could be that we find a system, and for example, there might be this idea of a kind of black swan. So these events, it could be the development of a technology that we were unable to anticipate. This is why I think our ability to learn how we anticipate systems is really important. But inevitably, there are going to be black swans, right? So there might be a development of a technology. For example, the development of transformer models in AI systems, right? This is why we've had this most recent uptick of kind of image generation models. for example, or like kind of ChatGPT. This is because the development of like transformers, essentially, which stems from neural net development, that kind of thing, GANs, that transformers all of a sudden made these more lifelike and more efficient in the way that they're computed, right? There are going to be other innovations like that. I mean, similar to the kind of development of graphene, right? There are thousands of papers that are being produced around this daily, right? Chances are that there's going to be something, and it's going to be in the offing, that actually completely disrupts the way that we look at this problem, right? And takes it into another layer, right? Equally, there are kind of environmental impacts here, right? So there's looming conflict. There's more autocratic governments in power in the world than like democratic ones, supposedly, for the first time in a long time. Yeah, we're moving towards a period of great instability. Yeah, but also things like, you know, when's the next Carrington event? Yeah, solar storm that completely destroys digital technology. There was kind of one slide that I wanted to show just to kind of illustrate this. Yeah. You familiar with the works of Herbert? This is June. Yeah. This is a civilization that has basically eschewed the impact of technology, particularly intelligent systems, right? Because it nearly brought the civilization to its knees, right? So this is a civilization that's actually pushed back on this kind of rapid development of intelligence because of the damage that it could potentially do, you know? Ultimately, what we see here is that computers in this kind of imaginary world are brought back into the practices of humans, right? So these individuals here are the computers in the society. So they're highly trained individuals, right? The first computers in the Second World War, before the Second World War, were women in a room computing, right? Yeah, so computers used to be humans. It may actually go back to a situation where they are again, right? Now they may be augmented in some way, or it may be that we actually decide to just put these systems away. It may be that they're too dangerous for us to actually deal with. I hope that kind of answers your question. You can't anticipate the future, and that's why I think it's important to invest in trying to do that, you know? Really, an arms race. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exciting times. Hi. Great question. I think this is the crux of the issue, right? In this context, in this room in 2024, what I'll be honest with you, what I see, right? Your Elon Musk sort of like corporate structure, yeah, the kind of male, pale, and stale model, right? This idea that the developed world is the kind of savior of the rest of the world in some I'm really skeptical about the idea of international development at all, right? But I will say this: if you look at the development of the impact of AI on crop, you know, on agriculture, for example, right? The reality of it is, if you look at the developments of, you know, the way that we understand genetic structures or protein structures, or the way that we use AI very basically to measure, you know, like the quality or growth of a crop, for example, on a field, right? The reality of that is these are very top-down infrastructure systems, right? The danger is that essentially markets, right, are controlled by technological interests, right? The reality of it is that development will be done to developing countries unless those developing countries address this kind of stuff that we're talking about today, right? So unless we get hold of, get inside the decision curve, developing countries become the places where these innovations are occurring, and there are infrastructures that can kind of protect and apply that IP within that context, right? Development will happen from the ground up, or it will be done to the developing nations, right? And I think evidence suggests that at the minute it's something that is transported in, right? Global capital and technology is kind of imported into these contexts. And essentially, these markets are restructured and, formed into the kind of global system, right? The reality of it is that we have opportunities in every moment to think about how we kind of reverse the flow of that, or at least create feedback loops. Yeah. So I think that would be my perspective on development, right? And that's why I think it's interesting. This is why I'm interested in learning ultimately, because it's that learning, that ability to frame, to ask the right questions, yeah, to think in that kind of very zoomed in, very zoomed out way. Each of us as individuals, as researchers, as students, that's where the conditions for great change come from, right? So it's in those moments of thinking that make it possible to not just be done to basically be a participant in development, essentially. Does that make sense? Yeah. I think this is where you get this. I mean, there's a real interest for me in collaboration and kind of participatory design. And it's ultimately just determining who designs for who, right? Now, I've developed pieces of technology in a kind of classic corporate context. What I see the most profound change happening is when those technologies are developed at the moments of use, right? So in that diagram, when someone actually is there with the tool in the ground, that's the site for design. Yeah. And I think that's the potential, right? So I think it's this kind of there's a great potential for kind of localism in terms of development, That would be my point of view. That would be my perspective. I hope that makes sense. I'm happy to give time, but I understand we're on short. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It was actually absolutely enlightening, and it's a thought-provoking section. And we are very grateful for being with us this day, and for sharing your wealth and knowledge and expertise with us today. And so your insights in the world of creative digital design, collaborative innovation, and the broad spectrum of possibilities in learning and design have truly inspiring. So on behalf of Digital University and all of you present here in online and also in offline, I present grateful moment for us. Thank you, sir. And I honorably invite our Registrar, Digital University Kerala, to present a small token of appreciation to our chief guest. Thank you, all of you. With this, we have concluded this session.
Your area. Yeah, so I will just like one way. We did separately. Rainbows were fruit and diseases are. Many doesn't do. It's little different. Like, yes. Into the game. That's where